Okay. It's 7 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. Good evening. This is Mark Sandine. I'm chair of the Hanscom Area Towns Committee, and permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. So when I call your name, could you please respond in the affirmative? Emily Mitchell.
Present.
Linda Escobedo.
Present.
Jim Hutchinson.
Present.
Charles Hornig.
Present.
Gary Taylor. Ephraim Flint.
Present.
Steve Hagan.
Can I yours?
I figure out how to do it. Wait a minute.
Stephen Hagan.
Steve Hagan is there, huh?
Margaret Copey said she would be joining later.
Figure out where to do it. Maybe I'll click here. No.
Hey,
Wait a minute.
Bob and Sharon, can you
Oh.
mute yourselves? We can hear you. Thanks.
okay. Jessica Casserly. Glenn Kerniski.
I don't need to be.
I think Glenn is out, right, Jessica?
Is this a meeting or
That's
what?
correct.
Okay. Amber Goodspeed.
Present.
Is Mike Vadalaro here?
I'm not sure if he was able to attend.
Okay. Simone Monteleone.
I'm not on any list.
Dr. Neelakshi Huda. Neil Rasmussen.
Present.
So thank you. So we have a number of people who are attending tonight, but we are hearing a lot of noise in the background. So if you're not speaking, I would ask that you mute yourselves. If you could do that, that would be wonderful. Okay. So the time is now 7:02 on Thursday, April 25th, 2024, and I call this open meeting of the Hanscom Area Towns Committee to order. Please note that this meeting is being conducted remotely, consistent with Massachusetts state law, allowing public bodies to continue holding meetings remotely. For this meeting, the Hanscom Area Towns Committee is convening via the video conference application Zoom as posted on all 4 town websites identifying how the public may join. Some reminders before we begin. This meeting is being recorded, so please be aware that others may see you and anything that you broadcast may be captured by the recording. Please remember to mute your phone or computer when you're not speaking, and each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by a roll call vote. So before we get started with the formal agenda, I just wanted to confirm that Linda will be taking meeting minutes for the meeting. Yes, Linda?
That's correct. I will be.
Thank you so much. And I also wanted to acknowledge that this will be Linda's last HATS committee meeting, as she will be completing her 2nd term on the Concord Select Board prior to our next HATS committee meeting. So I wanted to thank you, Linda, for your service to both the town of Concord and to the HATS community.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mark,
Yes.
I note that Steve Hagan did join us.
Okay,
can
thank you.
Amend the roll.
Thank you.
I finally figured out how to unmute. Yes, present. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we will have a very full agenda this evening focused on the proposed Hanscom North Airfield development. And so we'll be hearing an update. So, okay. So we'll be hearing an update on the air pollution study led by Dr. Neil Lakshi Huda and funded by the Hanscom Area Towns, is investigating the potential impact of ultrafine particulate matter from jet aircraft to the residents and workers in the town surrounding.
Hey, Mark, do you want to make me co-host so I can mute people who aren't muting themselves?
That sounds wonderful. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, we also have several members of Hanscom Area Towns Boards of Health and Health Departments attending the meeting this evening. to help facilitate a discussion regarding any health-related concerns of the proposed Hanscom North Airfield development and to hear any thoughts or comments about the health-related aspects of the proponent's draft environmental impact report. And after that, we will be having a presentation from Neil Rasmussen, who's the president of Save Our Heritage, on an independent study results regarding ferry flights and emissions. And because we have such a full agenda this evening, we'll be foregoing the usual community updates from neighboring towns, but we will have time for some brief updates from the representatives of Massport and Hanscom Air Force Base. We'll look forward to hearing community updates from the local towns at our next HATS meeting. And finally, on the agenda tonight, we will review a proposed comment letter from HATS committee members to Secretary Tepper and Mr. Strisky of the MEPA office on the proponent's draft environmental impact report. With that, I'd like to proceed to the first item on our agenda, which is to approve the meeting minutes from our last meeting. So the meeting minutes have been sent out prior to this meeting. Has everybody had a chance to review them? Is there any comments that anybody would like to make?
They look good to me.
Okay, well, seeing no comments, I will move that we approve the meeting minutes of now February 8th, 2024.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. I'll take a vote. Linda Escobedo,
Hi,
Jim,
Aye.
Emily Mitchell,
Aye.
and I'm a yes, Mark Sandine. So the meeting minutes are approved unanimously. And so the next item on our agenda is to hear from Dr. Nilakshi Huda, who's the Assistant Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Tufts University, who has an update on the ultrafine particulate matter emissions study that has been funded by the 4 towns. And also here tonight, I believe also here tonight from the study team are Dr. John Durant of Tufts University and Sean Miller from Boston University. And with that, I would turn things over to Dr. Huda.
I'm a little confused about what I'm sharing on the screen. Can you see a black slide?
yes,
All right. It's looking a little different on my side. Okay, I got it now. So thank you for providing this opportunity to offer an update to Hanscom Area Towns Committee on what we've been up to with the Hanscom Air Quality Study for the last 2 months. This study is being funded, the data collection aspect of it, by the towns of Bedford, Concord, Lincoln, and Lexington in coordination with Hanscom Field Advisory Committee. Our goal is to collect data on air quality impacts of operations and activity at Hanscom. This work is also being supported in equal amount by MCAC, that is supporting the data analysis portion of the project. Our motivations here are threefold. Foremost was to fill the knowledge gap. To the best of my knowledge, when we started working on this, I was not aware of any study that had systematically studied what the air quality impacts near Hanscom were. Then we wanted to respond to the Northfield DIR with some sort of sound scientific data and what the possible impacts are. And then we can scale from them as to what the possibilities of impacts in the future are. And lastly, we wanted to raise accurate data-driven awareness of the potential impacts of jet activity on local environmental conditions. On the left-hand side, you'd see a map. This was just some measurements that we did out of curiosity that sort of, when we heard about the Northfield expansion, we wanted to figure out just see what the impacts are of the current activity at Hanscom on ultrafine particle concentrations, and I'll explain why we focus a lot on ultrafine particle concentrations. And this is just one run we did out of curiosity for a couple of hours. And when the wind was from the southwest, we can see that we had somewhat higher concentrations, actually quite a bit higher. The darkest colors there are 80,000 in a residential area. Downwind of the Hanscom Air Force, Hanscom Airfield. So plain exhaust is a complex mixture. I made the mistake of suggesting that we are taught an idealized combustion equation of carbon, hydrogen, hydrocarbons, so hydrogen and carbon, and we oxidize it. Basically, that's a combustion reaction, and we produce CO2 and H2O. And I was corrected. Depends on which high school you go to. So I'm going to say most of us are aware of the idea that there is no such thing as idealized combustion in real world. We put in hydrocarbons, which has and a lot of additives and a lot of adulteration in the fuel that goes in, and a lot of stuff comes out. There's a lot of nitrogen in the air. Nitrogen, when you put it through a really high temperature combustion, we get nitrogen oxidized and NOx byproducts as well from the combustion. If you ever can't fall asleep, I would suggest you try to walk through all these pathways on the figure on the left-hand side of what the byproducts are of such combustion, what are the health effects and environmental effects of those combustions. But it's a lot to study, all of those, and it gets really expensive really quickly. All of these are valid byproducts of the combustion that takes place in jet engines. We have picked one pollutant to look at, and I'll explain why. The one pollutant that we look at are called ultrafine particles. They are smaller than 100 nanometers in diameter, and it is just one physical size-based lens to look at this complex mixture, which is contained of a lot of things. And there's some very involved chemistry. The mixture that comes out of the jet plane's exhaust, right at the exhaust plane versus, 10 minutes post-processing in the atmosphere versus several hours of post-processing as it transfers downwind and downwind and downwind. It's a very different composition, as it evolves. That being said, I have to pick one proxy of studying this, one really good proxy that tells me about what the impacts are at ground level of this air pollution, right? So I've picked ultrafine particles. Why? And not only are they important for health effects, which I'll show on the next slide, but because it's a physical form of pollution that is abundantly present near airports, and it's abundantly emitted from the airplanes. And together, that makes it really easy for me, with high degree of confidence, to identify what the impacts are on ground level concentrations. It is not that airplanes only produce ultrafine particles. Obviously, I'm just using it as a proxy to say this is where the area that is impacted and all the other combustion byproducts are in that air parcel. I'm just measuring the ultrafine particles in that air parcel that's enriched with a whole bunch of other pollutants. So what are ultrafine particles? As I explained earlier, they are particles smaller than 100 nanometers. 100 nanometers is roughly the size of a virus. So they're very small particles. We report them as count per centimeter cube. Centimeter cube is, those old-fashioned sugar cubes were 1 centimeter cube. You'll see numbers like 80,000, 100,000, maybe 5,000. They're not typos. They're not some extra zeros in there. These are really small particles, so you can fit a lot of them in a very small space. So 1 centimeter cube, small space, large number of particles can fit into it because they are very small particles. Excellent markers of fuel combustion. Not just jet fuel, just about any time you have a combustion process going that relies on fossil fuel, you make a lot of ultrafine particles. And they're emitted in huge numbers by jet planes. So makes my job easier. I could attempt to PM 2.5, which is also produced by planes, but in small quantity compared to the high background level. So then my job becomes of trying to find needle in a haystack. And I'm just going to make it easier for myself. I'm just going to look at the big haystack of ultrafine particles that comes out of jets. Hence, UFP being our choice here. They are very important by themselves. They've been associated with a whole bunch of health effects. These two are really good readings. The first side actually documents them from the perspective of aviation emissions. And the second one is a really good, easy to read article on ultrafine particles. If you want to take away one word from it, it's their health effects are driven by inflammation. Inflammation being the one word that you could take away. So now moving on to our study plan, we suggested in the proposal that we submitted that was funded that we're going to do the study in 2 phases. Phase 1 being conducted in winter or the cooler weather, and phase 2 that's going to get conducted in the summer or the warmer weather. And simultaneously, we'll also do some mobile monitoring to track out what the extent is. And phase 1 and phase 2 would focus on stationary monitoring. Stationary monitoring being we'll be stationary, we'll be at site at institutional sites or residences and make measurements for at least 4 weeks. And mobile monitoring, we are in a car, you're moving around, you're mapping the extent of the area that's being impacted, but we are at a lot of locations within the same day, but we are not at one location for a long time. Stationary is the reverse of that. We are at few locations, but for a long period of time. So stationary monitoring has been accomplished for the winter season. In fact, today, John wrapped up monitoring at a whole bunch of sites. We still have 1 site ongoing. Moving to data interpretation, this is my favorite or the most complex part of the process. Monitoring is relatively easy. This is where lots of gears are in motion and they all depend on each other. So let me talk a little bit about at least 3 sort of these independent or somewhat independent things that make a difference to data interpretation. First thing that we want to look at or visualize are the time series or the temporal trends that we are seeing in the data. Are the trends the same across sites? What are the time scales over which the concentrations are increasing or decreasing? And the way the study is set up, because I'm just doing a month of 4 weeks of monitoring in winter, 4 weeks of monitoring in summer, that only allows a sort of a comparison season to season, but definitely not looking at the whole annual trend. But we can just definitely look at anything that's on diurnal or hourly basis. And that's where we sort of look at, right, I'm seeing this fluctuation in time in concentrations. Is it lining up with the fluctuation in flight activity that I'm expecting? Another key factor that plays a role is meteorology, and it plays a role somewhat similar to the temporal diurnal trends, because there's the perceptible felt aspect of meteorology, like the wind speed and wind direction or the weather fronts that are passing, all of which make a huge difference to the concentrations that we see at ground level. But also there's diurnal mixing, which we can't, we human beings, you don't feel it that, oh, this is a very well mixed atmosphere or this is not. But that's also happening on a diurnal scale. And that plays a role into what we'll see in terms of concentration. And last in the gear, and this is the most complicated to parse out, is the flight activity itself. And so by flight activity, we mean the number of flights that are taking off, but also the types of flights they are and how much taxiing is happening at the runway itself or at the airport itself. What is the ground support equipment? How much is that emitting? What is the runway use pattern? Because that changes by wind. And depending on what source we gather our flight activity from, there's some variation in that itself. So we want to look at as much flight activity as is possible, collate all those sources and get the most complete picture. And Sean, I'm going to hand off the presentation to you so you can talk about these method aspects, and then you can switch it back to me.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, great. Hi, I'm Sean Muller. I'm the data analyst on the project, and I'm here to talk about the data. So we have our instruments in the field, and they're collecting data every second. So what this means is we have a ton of data. And what's a ton of data? We have over 2 million measurements across our 8 sites. And so what you can see in the first screen grab is just an image of some of our raw data from the instrument. And so you can see the model type, the serial number, and you can see the data that we're collecting. So there's a timestamp, you can see the date, time, you can see the concentration. That's the concentration of what we're interested in, ultrafine particles. And then you can see some other items related to the instrument, like status flags and pulse height. So we have these 2 million measurements that are made on a second-by-second basis, and then I read them into programming languages. So I use R, I use Python, common for scientific data analysis. And so what we're really trying to do is just look at the raw data. We're trying to understand what can this tell us, and is there anything that's going on with the instrument that we need to understand. So we take our 1 second measurements and we're going to aggregate it into 2 different periods. We aggregate it up to minute average as well as 1 hour averaging periods. The data is a little bit less noisy, and we can learn different things from 1 minute data versus 1 hour averaging periods. And so as we're doing this, you can see in the bottom part of the slide is just a little snippet of code. This is not to scare you, but it's mostly just trying to show the level and depth of analysis that we're doing. So this is just a quick function that I designed in R that's helping us try to understand our raw data. So you see the function, and essentially what it's doing is it's working on that raw data file to produce a visualization like you can see on the bottom right. And this visualization helps us understand what's going on with the data and the measurements, because what we're able to see is not just the concentration, which is in the top window, but we're able to see the pulse height, which is an important variable for our monitor, as well as at the bottom, we're looking to see if there are any status flags. So instrument errors that are automatically flagged by the instrument itself. So it's a lot of data wrangling and analysis to try to understand our measurements and what it's telling us. And so finally, we could link this with, as Nalakshi was saying, meteorology and flight emissions. Next slide. So as Nalakshi was alluding to, we are really interested in ultimately tying our collected ultrafine particle data with meteorology and flight activity. We've really got our hands around the meteorology, and we're working our way through the flight activity. So you can see here that I've highlighted some screenshots of 3 different sources that we're working on. The first one is an ADS-B single receiver. Thank you, Christopher Elliott, for this data. And so what I've tried to do is with this type of data, we're getting recordings of flight, latitude, longitude, and altitude every 30 seconds. So we're trying to interpolate where are the flights between those 30 to 60 second measurements, and where are they in relation to Hanscom, as well as our monitoring sites. We're also looking at flight-aware data, which was interesting about the flight-aware data is it's able to give us a lot more information, particularly about the takeoff runways and arrival runways, which we hope to integrate into our analysis. And then finally, we're looking at the Massport data itself. And what's really interesting about that data set, although we don't have it in a raw form to analyze the way like we are with the other 2 data sets, it's really interesting for visualization. So we're kind of playing these 3 data sets together where we'll identify particular time periods of interest, and then we can go back and the Massport visualizations of the flights are really helpful for us to look at what's the tail number, what was going on with arrivals, departures at the same time. So we have a bunch of different sources of flight emissions, and we're all trying to work and use them together to come up with a good understanding of the flight activity during our study period. Thanks, Nalakshi. I'll hand it back to you.
And they all vary ever so slightly. So I want to convey 2 concepts to you before I show you results and also keep talking a little bit about our methods. So you'll see a lot of time series or some time series in the graphics today. And I might use the word baseline and spike quite frequently. What do I mean by baseline? Baseline is sort of a relatively gradual increase and decrease in the concentration, and you want to focus your eyes on the bottom aspect of these lines, and that's sort of the baseline, increase or decrease. You want to also look at and perhaps see how big a curve or how broad a curve that is. That tells you, what the duration of that increase or decrease was. If you see increase and decrease coincident with, morning rush hour and evening rush hour, that's probably driven by traffic. If you see something that's happening for a whole bunch of days, maybe there's a high pressure setting and the wind's not moving as much. Then there are these things called spikes. These are relatively rapid increase and decrease in concentrations, and concentrations increase tenfold really quickly, and then also dissipate eventually really quickly. And we call these spikes. So this is actually real data from the study from 2 Lexington sites. So L1 and L2, which are a good half-mile apart. They're both institutional sites, so I can reveal their locations. One of them is DPW building in Lexington, which is pretty much under the flight path, and another is a school in Lexington, Diamond Middle School. There are very few things that are going to cause spikes at 2 buildings that are 0.5 miles apart, and they're good few stories high. And why is that few stories high important? Because, you know, I'm not going to expect a single car or somebody idling a truck 4 stories down to create a spike at the same time at DPW and also at the same time at Diamond Middle School. They're half a mile apart, right? So there are very few explanations if you see a spike on 2 roofs half a mile apart. And that's where the interesting part of this data analysis lies, is that we look at each of those individual spikes and then go back and replay the flight activity and see if we can find a reasonable cause for those spikes. Next slide. And it's also important to know which way the wind is blowing. So that plays a key role in the way we interpret our data. So here Sean has plotted some arrows showing the wind direction. Obviously not a helpful way to look at wind direction. And there's an entire visualization scheme that goes into when we're trying to interpret wind direction. I'll show you that later. But if we zoom in a little bit, this is a really good example and illustration of our method. So on the left-hand side, you'd see a Diamond School, sort of a flat line when the winds are from the south. At DPW, you'd see something that's going on when the winds are from the south. And that's why it's really important to have multiple sites in the area. So I can then verify whether certain spikes are occurring at both locations, half a mile apart, and then only focus on those spikes. Obviously, there was something going on that was very local to DPW during the south winds in this data set. And what spikes are interesting are the ones that are happening coincidentally at both on the right-hand side of this graphic that we're going to eventually study case by case. Actually, the next slide that I'm going to show you, I'm going to pause on it for just 3 seconds because it has, I have data that is plotted for certain residential locations just to sort of protect the privacy of people. And I will not focus on that slide a lot. What I want you to notice is really quickly in 3 seconds that the sites are sort of all around the airport. And that is what's the point of that study, is to have a lot of sites around the airport in the area, capture the same signal at lots of locations within the area. So I can say that the signal is present not just at a location, but it's sort of pervasive over this entire area. So I'm going to show you that for just a couple of seconds and then move on to this slide, where I'll discuss this concept in detail with graphics that are similar to what I showed on the last slide. So we use this tool, what we call the pollutant rows, that helps us discern what is the meteorology pointing at, what are the wind speed and wind direction indicators pointing at, basically what wind direction is associated with some of the highest or on average higher concentrations. So here's sort of like an idealized version of the Hanscom runways and a couple of institutional and I believe a residential site that we had in the area. And I've laid out these sites to the best of my ability in the same orientation that they really actually exist. So what you want to look at is where are the darker, richer, redder colors here on these 360-degree sort of wind tiles. And it seems like when you look at the sites that are in Concord or Lincoln, the highest concentrations are when the wind has an easterly component to it. That is when it sweeps over the airport. And it's the flip in the Bedford area. When the wind has a southerly component to it or a westerly component to it, that's when we see the highest concentrations at these sites. Now, and here is data from 3 Bedford sites. It's not important as to what color of the line here represents exactly what site in Bedford. We had a couple of residential, we had a school in Bedford. What is important is that these 3 lines are practically following the same pattern, which tells me we are picking up the same signal with some variation, of course. Each site is slightly different than the other side, but it's the same signal that's pervasive over this area. The sites are good a mile sort of apart from each other. To reduce all this eventually into numbers and be able to say, all right, what was the concentration when the sites were downwind versus what was the concentrations when the site were not downwind, we use this concept of impact sector. We found, and I'll see the results, but we found that impact sector winds are generally associated with an increase in concentration. So what is impact sector? It's a sector of the 360-degree wide wind phi, and that diagram on the right-hand side illustrates it quite simply. That theta could be very wide, that theta could be very narrow, depending on where the sites are. But when the winds are from that broad impact sector that sweeps over the airport and over the flight trajectory, that's when we sort of sort out and classify the data and call it impact sector. And this is the wind that is like bringing over a parcel of air that's enriched with emissions. So we hypothesize that we should, if the airport is emitting something, or the flight activity and the trajectories when it cuts across the flight trajectory is emitting something, the concentrations should be higher. And it's important to note that transmission of air pollution is not instant. It's not nearly as instant as sound, which sound travels at its own energy, with its own energy, travels at 767 miles an hour. That's not how air pollution travels. Air pollution travels at the speed of the wind. When jet exhaust comes out, it has its own momentum, but it decays pretty quickly. And after that, it's really up to the wind to transport that air pollution downwind. Definition of calm is 3.5 miles or so an hour. So if you're 1 mile away from the airport and calm winds, it takes about 15-20 minutes for that air that's enriched with those emissions, even under sort of calm, windy conditions, to travel and arrive. Actually, that's the fastest of the calm conditions, because 3.5 is the highest cutoff of calm. But if it's windier, it could be something quicker than that. Nonetheless, there's this concept called the lag. So there's a time difference or a lag between when something's emitted versus when I can pick it up at these sites. So let's say a takeoff plume will be detected at different times at different sites, depending on how far they are. And the further they are, there'd be a greater lagged arrival. One of the worst conditions is when there's wind and then there's calm and then there's a gentle wind. That is when we get these kind of events in the time series. They look like, it was just flat, and then suddenly concentrations increase. You get hit by this wall of pollution, which is essentially this really rich parcel of air that was just sitting there in calm winds, and then suddenly gentle breeze, and then you just hit by this wall of pollution time series, shows you this increase. And it'll last howsoever long it'll last, depending on which way the wind is blowing. And here's data from a Concord residence and Thoreau Farm on this same graphic. So the green line is actually the green line is Thoreau Farm, and a Concord residence is the blue line. And you'd see the same trend in concentrations at both these sites, but a little bit of different concentration at each of these sites. The site that's further away would have lower concentration, and a little bit of time lag between. So the blue line always looks like it's shifted. It's not exactly as simple. So a lot of factors play a role. So it's a little complicated, and you got to parse through these time series one at a time. Now, here's some data from Thoreau Farm. Here's our definition of the impact sector there. And this diagram actually pretty much shows how we define the impact sector. So very easy definition of it would be, take the site. So the green dot, and if you can see it in the center, that's Thoreau Farm right here. And we draw a line from there to the very edge of the runway here, from there to the sort of edge of the runway at the other side. But also sort of the low flights that are taking off and then coming, and low flights that are landing, they have an impact. So sort of for preliminary purposes, I've just drawn it at north, and then we look at this sector of data and see how it compares with the rest of the winds. So Job Brooks House is at Minuteman National Park. That's also one of our Lincoln sites where we are making measurements. So if you were to guess what the impact sector there looks like, it's not going in the right order. what are folks seeing? This is what that impact sector would look like if I drew a line just from Job Brooks' house to the edge of the runway on the north side. Right here, if you can see my cursor, and then sort of draw out a line all the way to this edge of the runway, saying like any wind that sweeps over this broad area is my impact sector wind. And here's what the data looks like. And pretty much within that sort of impact sector is when I see these like highest of concentrations, the darker dots here. And that's our Lincoln site. So what do the time series look like during impact sector winds? That is when the sites are impacted by Hanscom by airport emissions or aviation related emissions versus other winds. This is a good example on the left-hand side of, again, the Concord side and the Lincoln side that I showed you on the last slide. I have the same color scheme, green and blue. On the left-hand side, you'd see the winds were from the north to east pretty much all the time. So consistently impact sector winds, lots of spikes in the concentration. And this is the concentration, like those exact same sites. When the winds were not from the impact sector, they were actually quite different, southeast. Right here, this is the wind direction at the bottom. And sort of the shaded line is whether or not the wind was from the impact sector. So pretty dramatic difference in concentrations and the way the time series looks as well.
Well, actually, I should warn you that we cannot see your cursor.
Oh, okay.
So you're saying you're pointing at things I can't see you put. Now I can see it.
Oh, my bad. All right. Thank you for mentioning that. But if I zoom in, I can still see the trends here, but you can see that the concentrations when the winds are not from the impact sector are pretty much like 0 to 3,000 for most part of the day, with occasional sort of spikes. It's very different when the winds are from the impact sector. And let's zoom in a little so you can see the trend. So it's pretty much for all parts of the day when the winds is from the impact sector, the concentrations are 5,000 or above pretty much. And just so, in US, we don't have any regulations for ultrafine particles, but World Health Organization has guidelines, and their guideline for acute exposure for 1 hour is 10,000. So this period, all of that was going to exceed it. On average, if I average it up, because the spikes contribute really heavily, all of this is going to exceed it. 3,000 is their sort of guideline for 24-hour or daily average exposure. And all of this would exceed it, but not this. This looks pretty good. The non-impact sector winds. So as expected, we observed higher average concentrations when the sites were downwind of the airport. On average, at Thoreau's farm, the concentrations were 2.3 times higher when the wind were from the impact sector at a residence in Concord, which is further downwind from Thoreau Farm. Obviously, the ratio would be lower. If it wasn't, then I'm not doing something right. So that lower ratio was 1.3. At Minuteman National Park, the ratio was 1.5. So that's still 50% higher concentrations when the wind is from the direction of the impact sector. At Bedford Residence and at a Bedford School, 1.8, 1.7. But I should say that these ratios are preliminary. Please don't memorize these numbers. These numbers will change. They will get refined. We're going to define our definitions for impact sector as we get more data. The sample size, the number of hours that we have in impact sector versus the other classification plays a huge role, because if the sector is narrow, I have a much lower sample size there. And then it depends on what time that wind was blowing in that impact sector. If it was all night and there was no flight activity, then those numbers are going to look lower. So the idea is that we sort of recommend that when we do these studies, so we capture all of that and the annual cycle of the wind. We try to set up these monitoring for 2 years. This is very short monitoring, so we have to work with a little bit of fuzziness in this data. And the closer that you get to an airport, sort of the fuzzier those boundaries of impact sector get. It's not as defined, because even in calm winds, that parcel that's sitting around the site sort of gets saturated with air pollution. Next slide. I also wanted to look at NO2, which is a regulated pollutant, and the DEIR mentions attainment and cites the Chelmsford site data. That is all correct. So Chelmsford site is located in Chelmsford at 5 Manning Road. Also note when DEP or EPA sets up these sites, each site has a purpose and it represents something. That Chelmsford site was actually set up to do near road NO2 monitoring. So you'd expect it to have higher NO2 concentrations because it's near road, it's next to 495. And the trends and concentrations at each of these sites can be quite different. And sites are purposefully located by the EP or EPA to avoid certain influence or to pick up and capture it. In this case, they want to capture the near road influence. And there's an open question on whether each of these sites is sort of representative of what area, and we researchers like to debate it endlessly. Just wanted to show you some data that we got for NO2 near the airport versus what Chelmsford looks like. So the gray line is Chelmsford data. The orange and the blue line are two locations, both of them in Bedford. You can see that there is variation. There is a trend to it. Generally, what we are reading in Bedford is actually lower than what DEP at the same time is reading in Chelmsford, which is a near roadway site where we expect NO2 to be higher. I've also pointed out NAAQS annual standard and NAAQS 1R standard on this. What's interesting to note is when you're studying NO2, or for that matter, any pollutant in communities that are near sources, you'd see these spikes. And again, sort of these spikes that we see, these lines that are going up and down, up and down, up and down. And usually they do average out. So when I take the annual average, if I was doing annual year-long sampling, or if I was doing 1 hour averages, they will average out. But it's important to know that these excursions or these really high concentration events do occur. And I just wanted to point that out here in this graphic. Right. What are the next steps for our study? We will submit our recommendations for the summer phase. I think we've at this point pretty well demonstrated that the impacts are sort of pervasive over an area, and once we've done that, we don't need to keep repeating 3 sites in an area or 4 sites in an area, and we just go ahead and pick one representative site. And we submit our recommendations for that. We'll submit a preliminary report in May. We'll also submit our findings and emphasize the importance of considering UFP in the DEIR. And then we'll begin our summer phase in July and August and a final report in 2024. And with that, I'll take any questions. I believe I'm way over my time. And I apologize for that.
So thank you, Dr. Huda, for that very insightful presentation and update on where we stand. I do have a couple questions for you before we open up to the rest of folks. So my first question is, so what does your preliminary data show about PM1, 0.1 concentrations in our communities, say, compared to World Health Organization standards or guidelines? How are we doing? What is it?
I was trying to show you the slide on which I summarized it, but I can also answer orally. Would you like me to go back to the slide?
No, fine. Just
those World Health guidelines are actually, I think, quite a bit low. The only 2 towns that I've ever seen get any close to sort of being in agreement with those are actually Lincoln and Concord, not even Lexington on the other side, which is on the downwind side of the highway too. So on a good day, when the wind is not from the direction of the airport, you might be close to it. It's certainly exceeding those when the wind is from the direction of the airport.
So we are seeing concentrations over World Health Organization guidelines when the wind is coming from the airport. Is that what I'm understanding correctly?
Yes, and in other wind directions too, but less frequently.
Okay. I have 2 next questions, which I think are somewhat related. So we hear a lot about the health impacts of particulate matter, and there's different sizes of particulate matter. Could you just say a word or 2 about why you're concerned about ultrafine particulate matter as opposed to 2.5 or 10 micron particulate matter?
Because ultrafine particles are very small, the smaller a particle is, the deeper that it can penetrate. In fact, they're so small they can cross the blood-brain barrier. Like when you breathe in, they can just cross over from here. And increasingly, there's surmounting evidence of the adverse health effects of ultrafine particles that range from cardiovascular to neurological. To my own work, which has shown that specifically aviation-related ultrafine particles exposure in women who were living and pregnant and living near LAX is associated with higher incident rates of preterm birth. And to me, it's a particular concern because they're not regulated, and we have to keep building up the evidence before it gets EPA thinks that, all right, this is enough heavy evidence and this is gone beyond correlation.
So the next question, which is very related, you were talking about the fine particulate matter, ultrafine can penetrate blood-brain barriers, but I'm also wondering about penetrating our buildings. Do we have similar concentrations inside our buildings as outside of our buildings because of that?
That's the point. Yes.
Pardon me, couldn't hear you.
Fantastic point. All right, so I'm not echoing now. Fantastic point. Thank you for raising that. We did that study in Winthrop, and we found that about 70% of these particles get indoors. So indoor is not at that point, indoors is not a refuge. Most people do spend a lot of time indoors, but particles do also get indoors.
So those are my questions. If folks have some questions, could you raise your hand and I'll recognize first HATS members and then other folks if we have time. Jim, go ahead.
Thank you. Excellent presentation, Professor Huda. I'm curious though, if in this study that we're going to do this year, you're going to end up with some kind of summary statistic of how often these incidents happen where the concentrations are higher than baseline or normal or however that's correctly reported. You know, percentage of number of days where it happens or percentage of the days of the time during the day that it happens or some other summaries. Can you talk about what kind of summary statistics you expect to derive before concluding this study?
We usually always report what the averages were, break them down into what the average was, a sort of when the winds were from the direction of the source that we are particularly interested in versus when it was not. So you'll have that comparison, you'll have the average, and I could also give you frequency distributions, so then you can sort of work out, or I could summarize for what fraction of the time did I see concentrations above the WHO guidelines. And I'm open to feedback. I'm sort of, as many stats as you want, we are happy to put them in. It's just another line in the code and I have a super data analyst on it. So please email me.
My feedback is that there's going to be some data analysts in the group because that's the kind of towns we live in that want the fine level of detail that you got into in today's presentation. But there's also a bunch of us who just need the executive summary level statistics about what's going on and why it matters. So I would encourage you to get both viewpoints in the final report.
Oh, absolutely. There's going to be a 2-page executive summary that's sort of, I always aim it to, I was taught by an airport manager nonetheless to aim it for an 8th grade audience, which is very different in the towns here. So there'd be that, and there'd be technical appendices.
So thank you. Any other HATS members have questions? Okay, then Jamie. And could you introduce
Hi. Hi. Sorry, it just took me a second to unmute.
Could you introduce yourself and your affiliation?
Oh, sure. I'm Jamie Banks. I'm a Lincoln resident. I'm also the founder and president of a nonprofit group called Quiet Communities. We focus on noise and related pollution really from a variety of sources, including aviation. I just, actually, I just have a comment, not a question. The ultrafine particles, you mentioned, the smaller the size, the deeper they penetrate really into the lung, and they can cross the blood-brain barrier and also into the systemic circulation, where they can do, all sorts of damage, not just neurological damage, but, other kinds of things that, we may not be aware of at the time.
So thank you. So seeing no other hands raised, I just want to thank Dr. Huda and her team for preparing this presentation and for also all the work you've done to get to this point so far. Okay, we have one other hand raised, then we have to move on because we've got a full agenda tonight, but Jennifer, and if you could introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Yes, I'm Jennifer Bowles and I'm a Bedford resident. I have one quick question to Professor Huda. Are there any simple mitigations that people in their homes and at schools can undertake, like air filtration or anything like that, HEPA filters that are simple and inexpensive to help with mitigation?
I have lots of opinion on HEPA filters. So HEPA filters are designed to do their job, which is clean up the air, and they're space heaters, right? The equivalent of a space heater. So it'll clean up the air that's around you. But when you're blanketed by this cloud of air pollution outside, it's like trying to clean a lake with a Brita filter. So you've got to go with like house-wide mechanical ventilation systems with really good filters to provide a clean environment in your home in its entirety, as opposed to just the space around you.
So
thank you.
Thank you. I said we were just going to take one more question. I'm sorry, Stephen. We do need to move on to the next part of our agenda. Thank you, Dr. Huda, for your presentation. The next part of our agenda is to discuss health impacts of the potential the proposed North Airfield expansion. And there are a number of questions that people have about health impacts of this, and I'd be interested in folks raising their thoughts as well as from their reading of the draft environmental impact report about comments they might have from that perspective. I know we have some members of boards of health and health departments in the audience, so if there are some questions from them or for them, I would be open to hearing your thoughts on that.
Mark, Steve Canner is Lincoln Board of Health.
Okay, so Stephen, go ahead. So now we're on the next topic. Go for it.
This is a bit of a segue from Steve Cannon from the Lincoln Board of Health. This is a bit of a segue from the last presentation. I thought I heard Dr. Huda say that she was using these ultrafine particles as a proxy for other pollutants, and so it's something that they could readily measure and that tended to go in the same direction as multiple other ones. I may have misunderstood that, but it seems to me that it would be useful to have that affirmed or not as to whether, since ultrafine particles are not a regularly monitored and measured issue, but other things, the NOx's and everything like that are, if we are getting data that talks about ultrafine particles that proves to be out of reason in terms of multiple sites, can we validly extrapolate from that to the other unmeasured things like the NOx's and all the other pollutants that put us at risk as a general health risk? That I think that's going to be important if we're going to have pushback on this program. That those other health risks are quantified in some fashion, and is this a valid indirect proxy for that?
There were a couple of questions there. So we are making simultaneous measurements of NO2 and UFP in the summer phase. I also have some NO2 measurements here, but I'm going to just bring in my really fancy machine and do it in summer. There is already demonstrated excellent correlation between PNC and NO2, and we can put that in the report. But is it extrapolatable from that? Like if 10,000 UFP concentration is equivalent to 50 B of NO2, that cannot be done. But again, it's not like, you know, there's a invisible filter in the air and only ultrafine particles it's the entire enriched air parcel that's hitting the ground and creating these increases in concentrations. And I think it's very fairly logical to assume that they don't exist in isolation. They're just a proxy of the complete complex mixture that exists. I don't think it's a logical pushback to that argument.
May I comment? Has that argument been engaged in other settings where other people with an interest in pushing back would be pushing back? That this is not, there may not, if it has not been, that has not been sufficiently demonstrated, even though it is logical for that to be true.
Some of them has been, so NOx, PNC, black carbon, they all sort of correlate and increase at different levels depending on where you are. That has been demonstrated. Did that answer your question? I could go on and talk.
No, I think it does, but at some point, this information will not only be for worrying about health risks, but then how do we make an argument that there's enough of the health risk to do something politically and legally, if in terms of the expansion of the of the flights. And clearly, getting some information, and you will be able to relate the amount of these pollutants to the frequency of flights at some point, because at some point we're going to be talking about more flights, and that we need some kind of metric that would tie that to, so you could extrapolate to what higher numbers of flights are going to be in terms of these pollutants. Is that fair? That's where we're going.
Yeah, I wish that was where we're going. I can do very limited stuff with just one sort of month of data in the summer and 1 month in the winter. Ideally, I would have wanted to have complete coverage for at least a year. The ideal best practice for doing this kind of work near airports is actually 2 years. Unfortunately, I was the one who's writing that report, and I know better. I'll do my best as to what I can scientifically, defensively deduce from those 2 months of data.
No.
Okay. So thank you. So we've had a lot of conversation about fine particulate matter. Are there other issues that folks would like to raise or concerns they'd like to raise about health impacts of the proposed North Airfield expansion that or their reading of the draft EIR? Dr. Heiger-Bernays?
Thank you, Mr. Sandine. Wendy Heiger-Bernays, Chair, Lexington Board of Health. Thank you, Dr. Huda and team for presenting these data. As we accumulate the evidence, I'm going to focus, Mr. Sandine, very briefly on this, because I think what's going to be really important is adding to the body of literature and demonstrating that this literature, as it expands, is tightly connected to the health literature, right? From this information, these data, we're going to have some strong measurements, very short periods of time, but I believe that we're going to have to do a very good job of tying that to the health implications. And I think one of the issues that still is up for discussion is the dose-response relationship between the amount of ultrafine particles and either the frequency or severity of effect. So I want to make sure that we're able to do what we can with the data, but that we stick to the science and that's supported. With regard to other issues related to the DEIR, I am concerned about a couple of things that I think have not been addressed, specifically sections or I'll call them parcels of Hanscom are Superfund regulated. They're regulated as both 20 parts of them as 21E sites, state Superfund sites. And the difference between a federal Superfund site and a state Superfund site is that the state regulates petroleum. Federal Superfund does not regulate petroleum releases. And so I think the DER is silent on the regulation of both federal and state Superfund, and it does not address issues that were identified prior, the movement of soils, the permits needed to do that properly, and the potential health impacts of moving and modifying use at those sites. In particular, we know that there is evidence of chlorinated solvent and PFAS in groundwater. Downstream, down gradient communities are drinking water downstream of these 4 communities is potentially impacted. And chlorinated solvents are particularly problematic because they may be in groundwater, well, they are in groundwater, and they are also potentially result in vapor intrusion. And what that means is that the chlorinated solvent is volatile and can rise up through cracks in basements and in structures, resulting in indoor air exposure to the chlorinated solvents. And the state does a very rigorous job of regulating vapor intrusion. So those are a couple of things that I have seen in the DEIR that have not been addressed, and they are health issues of which I'm concerned.
Thank you, Dr. Heiger-Bernays. Jamie. Jamie, you're muted.
Yeah, I did want to raise the issue of noise as having potential impacts. The kind of noise that is emitted by aircraft has strong low frequency components. That low frequency noise can easily penetrate walls and windows. It is particularly harmful to non-auditory health. So that's something to pay attention to. And I just wanted to say that the literature, the scientific literature in the area of aviation noise and health impacts has really expanded dramatically over the past decade. And I was just made aware of an issue, a special issue of the journal Circulation, Journal of the American Heart Association. They have just put together a compendium on the environmental impacts on cardiovascular health and biology, and looking at the combination, they actually call it the exposome of pollution, noise, other impacts on the health of the population. So there's a lot to explore there. And I would suggest that, people in the room here that are knowledgeable and can understand that, take a look at it. And I'm happy to provide references if needed.
Thank you. All right, seeing no other hands up, I think we should move on to the next agenda item, which is a presentation from Neil Rasmussen, who's the president of Save Our Heritage, and he's presenting some results of an analysis done on greenhouse gas impact and from Industrial Economics Incorporated. So Neil, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you able to see my slide?
Yes.
So we just talked about the impacts from noise and chemical pollution, but let's not forget, it depends on how much the air traffic is affected by this project. And the DEIR specifically says the air flights are going to go down as a result of this project, so we should all be celebrating. but I'd like to take a few minutes to explain why that's not true. And particularly one of the issues that's been interesting to a lot of people in the public is the issue of greenhouse gases and their effects. And as you may know, there's a signature of 14,000 people to the governor asking her to stop the project. There's 80 environmental organizations opposed to it, because common sense says when you double the private jet hangar capacity at an airport, you should expect a growth in the amount of flights. But that's not what the DER says. It says the opposite. And so to understand the issue, one of the central confusing parts has been this issue of ferry flights. And it's a lot of people have expressed confusion about it, or don't worry, we're getting rid of these ferry flights and so on. And I'd like to talk about that, but I need to put it in the context of the general greenhouse gas discussion, because there's a lot of interlocking parts affecting that. So the developer has made a number of claims involving this, which are, first, that the greenhouse gases should only be examined in the immediate vicinity of the airport. That's one of their claims. They've said the project will not make any new flights. That's another claim. They've said it's a net zero project, which is an interesting claim. And they've said electric aircraft and sustainable aviation fuel will eventually eliminate all these greenhouse gases, so don't worry. And they've said the project will reduce flights by 3,543 ferry flights. And that all sounds pretty interesting, so I'm going to take those one at a time. So one of the arguments they've made is, if we even examine greenhouse gases, which they don't want to do, we should only examine them right at the airport, like we might examine particulate pollution or some sort of organic VOCs. But that is a common way of analyzing those kinds of pollutants, but it's not appropriate when we're talking about greenhouse gases. And there's federal guidance on this subject that says that's not what you do. But they've used these models which only restrict the determination of any emissions to the aircraft immediately at the airport and not their total flights. Which is not, when you enable a new aircraft, you have to count its flights, not just what it did right at the airport as far as greenhouse gases go. The second claim they've made is it won't generate any new flights. And one of the they made a bunch of complicated arguments. One of them has to do with the ferry flights, but the other tricky one they've said is it won't generate any new flights because the flight growth is inevitable. It's an act of God and will occur no matter what happens. Therefore, the baseline that they use is growth. And they're assuming growth. Even if they don't build hangars, it'll grow at some amount per year forever. And so one of the tricks they've used is their baseline is not the current flight operations, but the expected growth that's already been projected at some time in the past. And that's completely unrealistic. And one of the things we should know is the industry overall is projecting, 5% growth per year basis for the whole private luxury jet system overall. And so that sort of helps you understand when you say they're not growing over the baseline is not now. The baseline is a trajectory of growth. Also, FAA guidance itself says you can't do it you can't analyze this for a specific airport independent of the hangar capacity, because hangar capacity, according to the FAA guidance, directly affects the number of flights. But they've disclaimed any relationship between hangar capacity and flights, completely the opposite of FAA guidance. Now, the other thing they've said that's interesting, said it's a net zero project. And the way they said that is they said, oh, we're going to put in solar arrays that will cancel out our emissions. And that's tricky because, first of all, the plan for solar arrays, even though it's in the design, in the DEIR, if you read the DEIR, it says it's optional and they have no plans to actually do it. They said that it's solar ready, but then they use the solar capacity and the offset that it generates to cancel out some greenhouse gases. but that doesn't occur unless you install it. But they don't say they're actually going to install any solar. But even if they did, the solar that they install would only, even though it's huge and would be by far the largest installation in Bedford or anywhere else nearby at 7 megawatts, and by the way, you can't get a permit for that very easily in anywhere, and probably not in Bedford. But if they even did that, it would only offset the emissions of the buildings themselves. Just the HVAC systems for the hangars generate a lot of greenhouse gases, and all of that gigantic solar array is only going to offset the buildings, and it wouldn't do anything about the hundreds of thousands of tons emitted by the aircraft. So it's very confusing when they say it's a net zero project, because they specifically left out the airplanes. The other thing they've said is electric aircraft or sustainable aviation fuels will make this problem go away. And that's just not true. I mean, just as a point of reference, batteries, the lightest batteries we know how to make, lithium, are 20 times heavier than jet fuel per unit energy. And the fact is you can't make an aircraft like a jet that's driven electrically that can fly over any significant distance. This is for short hop, lightweight, small operations, personal local transport, replacing certain kinds of helicopters and so on. It's never going to replace jets. Even the Federal Aviation Program plan says that. And then sustainable aviation fuels are literally a greenwashing activity. I was told by a guy at MIT that if we converted the aviation industry entirely to sustainable aviation fuel, it would use all the arable land on Earth to grow the crops to do that. And so that's obviously a non-starter. And by the way, if you cut down a forest and then produce sustainable aviation fuel on it, you can never generate enough recovery to offset what you did when you destroyed that forest. So there's just no future in that at all. And although it is subsidized, that people are trying to make it, there's federal subsidies for producing such fuel, it's not going to be here at any price anytime soon. So it's unlikely this will have any effect, at least by 2050. The project will reduce flights by 3,500 ferry flights. They said it a few different ways. They said, oh, it'll be at the most 3,500 flights. They said that once or twice, but then other places in the DEIR, it says, no, it will reduce the flights by 3,500. This is a very interesting claim, and if true, would be, very exciting. And just to clarify what these are unnecessary flights that are unoccupied. In other words, they don't have a passenger, and they occur due to lack of hangar capacity, right? And so the planes want to be at Hanscom, but they can't find a home there. So they go to another airport for a home, another local airport. And every time they want to go somewhere, they fly in from the other airport, pick somebody up, take them somewhere, come back to Hanscom, drop them off, and go home. And this activity is the kind of activity that would be affected if you built hangars. That plane would be located at Hanscom, and it would save those little short hop flights. And that's a benefit. But here's the problem. When you when you do a detailed study of this, you find out only 3 aircraft exhibit that type of activity that would benefit from hangars at Hanscom. And relocating those would eliminate 75 flights per year at Hanscom. And it would eliminate 100 tons of greenhouse gases. However, the remainder of all the hangar capacity they built would go to new aircraft that would generate hundreds of thousands of tons of greenhouse gases. So what happened was the proponent generated this claim of 3,500, but then said they were unable to do the detailed analysis to find out really what those planes were doing. They just found 3,500 flights that looked like they might be some kind of ferry flight. For example, they found 600 flights from Logan they said looked like ferry flights. But the Massport people pointed out to us that there are no based aircraft at Logan, So no based aircraft at Logan could be generating ferry flights through Hanscom. So all of those flights, all of those 600 flights from that one airport had nothing to do with hangar capacity at Hanscom, but they counted it anyway. And they have a lot of other kinds of flights that you can go into to understand why they counted them, but they really aren't ferry flights that would be helped by hangars. So they didn't attempt the correct analysis of looking at the detailed flight patterns of all those aircraft. So what we did is we hired a consultant. We knew this was coming and hired a consultant a year ago to investigate this, and an aircraft consultant who would go in and examine all the flight data of every aircraft that ever used Hanscom, and not only their use of Hanscom, but what they did the entire rest of the year, where those aircraft went all year. And what we did is we were able to determine the base of aircraft. For every aircraft that goes through Hanscom, we could find out where its base was, and then identify the pattern of use that would indicate that they would benefit from relocating at Hanscom. And what we found, what they found was the developer's claim is incorrect. There's no ferry flights from Logan. A lot of people have asked, well, maybe it would help Logan if we built these hangars. It eliminates no flights from Logan, and in fact could enable ferry flights in the reverse direction, where people would keep an aircraft at Hanscom and fly into Logan to pick people up and take off and go somewhere. So it actually could add air traffic into Logan. And it found only 3 aircraft. They generate 153 ferry flights, but some of those, they also generate other flights from their base that don't go through Hanscom that would relocate to Hanscom. And that's why the total number of flights that are reduced by moving them is only 75. But the benefit of relocating those aircraft is like between 42 and 140 tons per year, depending on how you calculate it, which, about 100 tons. But here's what the interesting part. They found that just adding one new aircraft at Hanscom, one new jet, offsets the greenhouse gas savings from all of the benefits that eliminating those ferry flights accomplished. So imagine we move 3 aircraft to Hanscom, get rid of their ferry flights, and then all the rest of the hangar capacity, which depending on how you count it, could be 50, 70, 80 jets. All of those are new aircraft generating new flights and new emissions. And you could see greenhouse gas emissions, they calculate, and there's different ways to calculate them, but they calculate them from 134 to 161 tons per year for the aircraft that would now move in. And some of the quotes are, the DEI errs in finding that the new hangar capacity will not increase operations or greenhouse gases. And the increase from greenhouse gas emissions would be from 950 to 3,900 times greater than the savings avoided by eliminating the ferry flights. And only 3 aircraft generating 153 ferry flights benefit from relocating to Hanscom Field. So this is why it's important to understand this affects greatly all the other kinds of problems we look at, because if it was true that the actual flights go down by this project, we should be happy and not worried. But that's not what's going to happen. According to this analysis, we're going to get a lot, just like common sense would expect. The fact that we're adding, doubling the private jet hangar capacity at the airport is going to increase flights dramatically. And none of their claims that they've thrown in this DEIR are supported by the reality. And it's misleading. And apparently the purpose of this misleading effort, which is extremely detailed, and they've thrown a lot of things here to try and convince us nothing's going to happen, is because they really want to avoid any analysis due to increased aviation. There's so many different ways they might be subject to additional analysis because of that. And if they can get away with saying that the flights don't increase, it eliminates a lot of burden for them to do a lot of other kinds of analysis and a lot of public scrutiny as well. So, one of the things that should worry everybody is look, one of these private jets, flying to a round trip to India in one of these private jets generates more greenhouse gases than an entire rural family in India generates in their entire lifetime. And there's just no way in a sustainable future there's any kind of social or other justice in us continuing to have an activity and grow it like this. And we certainly shouldn't be subsidizing it and driving it through our state government. And that's why, we believe that there shouldn't be any capacity like this built anywhere, not just at Hanscom, because it's antithetical to our local and federal emissions plans. And so I hope that you'll have an opportunity to look at this report and understand it as you consider your comments to the DEIR. Thank you.
So thank you, Neil. And on that last point, my question was, how could somebody who's listening to your presentation tonight get access to that report?
I can put a link. Is the chat open?
It should be. Oh, I don't know, maybe. Well, you can, you could tell me where is it possible just to say what website somebody could go to look at for it right now? Or if not,
you can go to saveourheritage.com, and it's like on the headlines in the corner, we have a study finds errors in developers' ferry flight claims, and you can click on that.
Okay.
And you can get right into the study through that. You can get it. It goes into a summary, but it has the link in it, the study in there.
So I just want to say thank you for doing the analysis of all a year's worth of aircraft data in and out of Hanscom. I think it's very important work. Is there other questions or comments from HATS members? Jim.
Mark, thank you. I wanted to echo your comments and thank Neil for this work. I think a lot of us had that common sense reaction that it doesn't make sense to add a bunch of hangars and claim there's no growth in traffic. And I greatly appreciate your study to confirm our intuition. Thank you.
Well, we thought about doing a study ourselves, and Chris Elliott and some other people were willing to dive in and try and do this work locally. But a lot of people advised us, like from the state, that said, look, that's nice, but you need somebody, an independent expert that we trust to do this kind of work. That's why we hired somebody.
Okay, before we go to outside of HATS committee, any other HATS committee members have any comments? Okay, Alan.
Hi, my name's Alan Wright. I have a question
And could
about.
you just tell us where you're from?
Oh, yeah,
Alan?
I'm sorry. I live in Roslindale. I'm a member of the Massport CAC. So I've been through a few of these presentations. The developers' presentations. And one of the claims that they make is that the hangars are necessary because the private jets have to be de-iced, and by doing it, by keeping them inside, you eliminate that de-icing, or you reduce the complexity of it. That may be true, but I'm struck by the fact that in order for a jet to fly at the altitudes that it does, through the atmospheric conditions that it does, it has to effectively be weather resistant, right? I mean, the skin of the plane and the engines are being subjected to hundreds of miles per hour of force against rain droplets and ice droplets and so on. So they're built in a manner to be relatively impervious. So they can presumably, therefore, be stored outside without any deterioration in their mechanical functioning. So maybe, yeah, in the occasional snow ice storm that exists, though less so in our warming winters, there might be some justification, but there's a de-icing facility there, I assume. so it makes me think that there might be some other purpose behind wanting to have hangars. If you're a private jet owner, can you drive your car into a hangar and disembark from the car and embark on the jet, and then the jet backs out? The point of my question is it nicer to have your jet parked inside a hangar for someone who likes to have convenience in their life? Is that one of the justifications? Or is there something else I'm missing?
Well, there's a lot of questions in there, but the justification for, the reason to have a jet is convenience. Because as we know, and we've got all these surveys done there, it's a luxury alternative to commercial flying. And there's no other, most of these trips that going out of Hanscom go to resort destinations and so on. So it's all about convenience. Some of these hangars have heated floors because people want to walk in and feel nice when they're getting on their airplane, right? So it's, that's what it's all about. There's de-icing capability all over the airport because a lot of planes will come and not be able to be in a hangar for some reason. And so they're only briefly. And so those facilities are going to be there. And that's also a subject of interest as to what's going into the groundwater and the Bedford well system. So there's a lot of issues there. I can't recall what some of the other points you made. By the way, I don't remember them ever talking about, I've been to a lot of these presentations. I don't remember them ever making the point that the purpose of the hangars was to stop the icing. But I think there was mainly discussions about the de-icing chemicals and their use outdoors.
I asked them a question in a presentation about the justifications. Why is a hangar necessary? And the answer I got was it eliminates the need for de-icing, and it just struck me as shallow.
Okay, Alan, thank you.
Yep.
So we're going to go to Stephen Hagan.
Thank you, Steve Hagan. I'm planning board from Bedford. Neil, your presentation was excellent. My question is, has anyone from the state or Massport seen this? What you're presenting makes the DER presentation looks so false as to be almost malevolent. And that's why, so we all salute you for that. But it seemed like there'll have to be a reaction from whoever drove their data, because this is almost it's almost fraud. I have to be careful; it's public and being recorded, but this is the discrepancies are so great. So thank you. And my question that I'm posing to you is: has anyone from the Massport or a member of the people who developed that report seen what you've got and raised any objections? Thank you.
I've given the report one time previously with some Massport people present, and they didn't have any comments. But remember, it's not Massport who's going to be excited about or concerned about this. It's the proponent, the developer. And remember again that the DEIR, some people think it's some sort of official document. It's a document paid for by the FAA, by the way, with the FAA money for the developer to try and push this thing through by hook or by crook. That's the entire purpose of this. It's not to be an independent, true assessment of the situation. And by the way, that's why they had full access to the flight data. They could have done the analysis to show there's only 3 aircraft that have these ferry flights, but they chose not to do it. And they chose to just throw out a big, huge number to try and snow everybody. So you can say what you want, whether it's just they won't say it's fraud. They'll say it's fair is fair. We tried to get away with something, and it's up to the Secretary of Environmental Affairs to try and hold the line.
Okay, Neil, thank you. I'm going to recognize Christopher Elliott.
Hi, I'm Christopher Elliott. I live in Lincoln, and I chair the Hanscom Field Advisory Commission. As Neil said, he presented this report at our last HVAC meeting, and I encouraged Massport to respond to it. They declined. That invitation is open. We'll have a May meeting. I would encourage Massport to prepare a response to this presentation for the May meeting, or the proponents. If the proponents would like to come, they would be more than welcome. I'd love to have this conversation close the loop. So thank you.
We'd like to see it in writing.
Thank you for that comment, Christopher Elliott. We did invite the proponents to come to this meeting tonight. Okay, so we are, I think seeing no other hands, I just want to thank you, Neil, for coming and preparing the presentation and making the presentation tonight and helping us understand the impact of a full year's worth of data of flights in and out of Hanscom. I would want to move now on to our next agenda item, which is an update from the Hanscom Air Force Base, who has a number of projects that they would like to give a short update on. And could Jessica speak to that briefly?
Absolutely, thank you. Jessica Casserly, I'm the Strategic Engagement Lead for Hanscom Air Force Base. As Mark said, I have a few different things to speak about this evening. The first is just a little information on our ambulance service contract. For decades, the base has had a stable ambulance service contract, but due to some recent Defense Health Agency funding cuts, we are unfortunately going to lose that contract later this year. At this time, there are no changes to the current contract that we have with Action Ambulance. They're providing us 24/7 ALS transport service, but we are working with the Defense Health Agency on contract options to revise what we have now and keep something in the short term until September 30th. Ultimately, what we're going to need to do here is bring in a new vendor. So we have a request for information out to industry now, and we're going to be gathering more information. And then once we have all of the details that we need, we'll be able to pursue new funding lines. So we've been keeping town officials apprised of this situation and have promised to keep them updated once we know more about our options and what our path forward is. And Mark had just asked me to share this with you all as well, as we speak to your town managers, administrators, fire chiefs, and police chiefs.
So thank you. So thank you so much for that. So my understanding is that that's what I was hoping for you to, you have been having conversations with our town managers and fire chiefs on this issue, correct?
We have, that is correct.
And my understanding is, at least for now, we're satisfied with what has been proposed. Is that my understanding?
That is correct. Nothing is changing in the near term. This contract will be up in September, so we have some time to get our new solution in place.
So thank you for that, and please go on and with your other projects.
Absolutely. So the other projects, the next two are construction related. The first one, we're proposing constructing a new single-story fire station to provide fire protection and firefighting services to the base. Additionally, a separate single-story passenger terminal and distinguished visitor lounge construction project is proposed. Right now, we have a fire station and a passenger terminal, but they are not properly sized and need to be modernized. So we are anticipating releasing an environmental assessment on these projects in early to mid-May, and hoping to receive funding for the projects in fiscal year 2027. Once that funding is secured and we are on contract, the construction phase would be about 2 years. Currently, the existing facility has all of these pieces, the fire station, passenger terminal, and the distinguished visitor lounge in one building. And the idea here would be to have the fire station separate under this new project. So as I mentioned, that environmental assessment will be out soon, and we'll make sure to share that through the normal channels that we would for public comment period.
And I'm sorry, Jessica, would those be on the east ramp? Is that what we're looking at?
So I believe the passenger terminal would stay there, yes. I think they are looking at other options for the fire station, so because they'll be physically separated now. And then just an update on our Sartain Gate project. We have recently put in our light poles and fixtures on the road. We have power to all of our sites. The big piece of information here, and probably something that anyone who's living in the Concord Lincoln area may have noticed, who travels Hanscom Drive frequently, is that there have been a lot of shifts to the traffic pattern there. We have half of the rotary installed to include coat paving and curving. And so now we've entered the next phase of the project to finish the other half of the rotary. So that has required the shift in traffic. So things are on track and moving along. Great progress has been made, and we're excited in the hopefully the near future to see this project completed after many years in the making, when the land was gifted to us by the state back in, I believe it was 2014. So long time coming. And then my last update is related to a hiring event that we have coming up. We held a very similar event last year. So May 23rd from 9 to 2 in Needham at the Sheridan Boston Needham Hotel, we'll be having a civilian hiring event. We have about 130 positions that we're looking to fill in a variety of career fields, everything from childcare to engineers and cybersecurity professionals. We have more details available on the base website, www.hanscom.af.mil. If you're interested, there's an opportunity to take a closer look at the opportunities that are available and registration details as well. And this is open to everyone, including recent college graduates, those with experience, those new to the workforce. So if you're so inclined and would like to share with your communities through any hiring support organizations that you may have, we'd be very grateful and happy to provide more details to anyone who needs them.
Thank you for that update, Jessica.
Thank you.
Jim, you had your hand up. Is your question answered, or do you still have a question?
I'll make a very quick one. I just wonder, Jessica, if you'd care to make any high-level statement about the size of the proposed passenger terminal or fire station relative to their current size?
So I unfortunately don't have those details, but that is something that I can certainly look into for you, and I am sure will be included in our environmental assessment. But I will talk to our folks in between now and the time that's released to see if I can get that information for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. So I want to check in now with Amber. Does Massport have any updates?
Hi, thanks, Chairman Sandine. I do have some updates. I'm Amber Goodspeed. I'm the manager of administration at Hanscom Field, and I prepare various operational noise and projects reports on behalf of the Port Authority and present them to the Hanscom Field Advisory Commission. At our last Hanscom Field Advisory Commission meeting, the updates that we had included Signature Flight Support Improvement Project. That project is near completion, and they plan to pave the area that they've demolished the previous fixed-based operating facility in May. Over Atlantic Aviation as well, they will be paving in May. Our runway 523 project. For those of you who aren't familiar with the project, we've been working on this project for 2 years. We are resurfacing runway 523, which is our non-primary runway, our shorter runway that runs generally north to south. And in 2023, we completed 2/3 of the project, removing 7.5 acres of impervious surface and replacing the entirety of the runway lighting with energy efficient LED lighting. So the northern third of the project will take place this August and take approximately 35 days. And I've asked our project team to attend the May Hanscom Field Advisory Commission meeting. And they have agreed, and they will be at that meeting, which I believe Chairman Elliott was here. I think he can tell me what the date was, but if I just look at a calendar real quick, it's always the third Tuesday of the month. So that should be May 21st. So that will take place on May 21st. And those meetings are also on Zoom at 7:00 p.m. The other project that we updated on was that Atlantic Aviation is installing a fuel tank at their existing fuel facility in the fall. When the facility was first constructed, I think it was in the 2014, between 2014 and 2017, in that time frame. They installed all the infrastructure and the location for that last fuel tank, but they have not installed it. So they will be installing a 20,000 gallon jet fuel tank in that location. And that will take place in the fall. So other updates that I had for the Hanscom Field Advisory Commission at our previous meeting was our State of Hanscom report. Our annual State of Hanscom report was completed, and it is posted on the Massport website. And after I speak, I can share it in the link if the chat box is open. And
this particular one doesn't seem to have a chat, so I apologize for that.
oh, that's okay. Well, I can share it with you in an email if you'd like to include it. But it's on the Massport website. If you go to, if you navigate to Hanscom Field, it's under About Hanscom, and there's a publications and reporting section, and includes not only the state of Hanscom, but our last year's annual noise report, and that gets updated for this year, later this year. The other updates that I had were about our security training exercise. Over the past several months, we've been working with our mutual aid partners on essential training in the event of an active shooter emergency on the Hanscom Field campus. So there have been several meetings leading up to a full-scale exercise with all of your community's public safety officials. We'll release a community advisory closer to the date of the exercise. And there will not be emergency vehicles traveling at speed within the towns during this emergency exercise. So residents of the community should not notice that the exercise is happening. But it's an exercise for an emergency response only, and the public is asked to avoid the area. And those are my updates.
Well, thank you, Amber, for coming to the meeting, and thank you, Jessica, for coming to the meeting and giving an update. I appreciate your time out of your day and preparing for this and for presenting to us. So are there any questions for either Jessica or Amber before we move on to the next? I see Anne Sobel.
Amber, what's the release date going to be on the ESPER?
Oh, that's a good question. Thanks, Anne. We plan to release that mid-May, submit it to MEPA in mid-May. And we will ask for an extended comment period time for review of that document. And when we do release it, I plan to let Chairman Elliott know of the Hanscom Field Advisory Commission, and I'll also let Chairman Sandine know of HATS, and they can share with both groups what that date will be.
Thank you for that. Linda.
Yeah, thank you, Amber, for your report. Do you know how the size of the new fuel tank storage compares to the existing?
The Atlantic Aviation fuel tank, the 20,000 gallon tank?
Correct.
It's an additional 20,000 gallons.
Additional, okay, thank you.
Any other questions, Linda? Okay, well, thank you. So thank you, Amber and Jessica. So with that, I think we will move on to the next item on our agenda. And the next item on the agenda is to review a draft comment letter on the our draft comment letter for the draft EIR. The letter would be sent to Rebecca Tepper, Secretary Tepper, and Mr. Stritsky, and who's the MEPA analyst for the project. The primary points of the letter are to highlight some of the things that we've talked about tonight. First, that this environmental concern that this North Airfield expansion would be a potential contradiction with the state's climate objectives, and that there does not appear to be in the draft environmental impact report any proposal to include measurement or analysis of the full impact of greenhouse gases or ultrafine particulate matter from aircraft operations that are departing from or arriving at the airport. And so the letter points out from the draft EIR how we came to this conclusion, which is that the air quality analysis would be completed consistent with the Massport 2017 ESPR. And in that 27 ESPR, the proponent states that they analyzed only 6 criteria pollutants, none of which includes CO2 or ultrafine particulate matter. And so the letter goes on to request that those be added to the list of criteria pollutants when the final environmental impact report is done, and that also that the impact be measured not just for the portion of the flight from 0 to 3,000 feet, but for the entire flight. And much of the language in the rest of the letter comes from a letter we wrote to the governor. The 4 towns wrote to the governor back in the fall. There's some information in the letter that points out just what the impacts of ultrafine particulate matter is as represented by 6 different scientific studies. And then finally, to the point that we were just hearing from Massport, that the 2022 ESPR is going to be due out in mid-May, and our current comment period for this draft EIR is May 10th. So the comment is that it would make sense for us to be able to have an extended period of comment time. We're asking for 60 days after the 2022 ESPR to come out so that we can review with current data in the context of recently released Mass DEP guidance for looking at cumulative impact of these types of things. So with that, that's a sort of brief overview of the letter. I wanted to check with other HATS members if there are any comments, questions, or concerns. Jim, go ahead.
Just wanted to confirm this is the version that you sent around yesterday to all of us?
Yes.
Great. I have reviewed that and am supportive of it.
Thank you.
Likewise, I have as well.
So thank you.
And I'll just add, I've also reviewed it and I'm in support, and I appreciate that of all the towns and all the groups, on this call, we're all emphasizing slightly different things, which I think will have I hope it will have a good impact on the secretary. I think we all need to be kind of clear-eyed about what the secretary is able to do and not do under the rules that we're dealing with. But I think this goes a long way to indicate the kind of concerns that we have, the breadth of concerns, and the deep analysis that we are all doing as residents and as leaders in our communities to just point out how deeply development like this does affect our residents.
Thank you for those comments, Emily. So now let me just open it up to other folks. Is there any other comments on this letter for members of the public or associates of the Hanscom Area Towns Association? Okay, seeing none. Jamie.
Yes, just one question. Why isn't noise included?
That's a good question, Jamie.
It's included in the Bedford letter, I'll tell you that. That's still in second draft now.
Mark, you want me to give my answer?
Please, Jim.
We are not just writing one letter, Jamie. we're writing multiple letters. And when we did the hats letter, we tried to just pick a couple topics that we knew all four of us could easily sign off on. The Lincoln letter will go into noise as well. And I hear that Emily says hers did also. So this is not the only letter that's going in.
Okay, okay, good to know. And the reason I bring it up is because we work with a lot of aviation groups, and noise, whether it's from private jets or the Next Gen program for commercial jets or other kinds of aviation, I mean, noise is really driving people crazy, causing a lot of stress and health and quality of life issues.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that, Jamie. Seeing no other hands raised. Stephen.
I was really impressed on the data about the inadequacy or deception or possible fraudulent presentation of the flight data. And because I was following that indirectly for the last 6 months as these things were talking about the number of flights that would be averted by where you based it, et cetera. And if that's totally bogus, which it appears to be by the detailed data, I just wonder what are the efforts going to be made to really make that public, to undercut what has been presented, including going to the Globe has previously had articles talking about this and why this is talking with the argument that basing the more hangar space will mean fewer of these carrier flights. That's all bogus, and I would think that getting a publicity, I'm unaware of, but do you have a publicity front to this to get it to the Globe or the Herald and other people to say, as part of this fight, to say that this is the data which have been promoted are bogus, in addition to the lawyerly and nice letters that are going out to the secretary?
So the HATS committee does not have a publicity arm and not trying to operate that way. There may be other groups that are doing that, but that's not the HATS role. But thank you for that, Christopher.
So the HVAC letter emphasized the ferry flight analysis pretty heavily. And we also included an appendix where I found approximately 20 different comments in the DEIR that depended upon the ferry flight, and I listed them. So I know the Bedford letter said that the ferry flight argument permeated the DEIR, and I made a list of that so they have an actual data of what that means. Thank you.
And Jim.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment also that the second letter that the Lincoln Selects are drafting does talk about the ferry flight issue that Neil has raised. So Stephen, if you want to get in touch with me about that letter, I'd be happy to show you what we're planning to say.
I'll be happy to follow up on that. I think that's one of the biggest arguments then I think it's one of the biggest reveals to me today about that the flight data appears to be bogus.
Feel free to get in touch and we'll talk more.
Done.
So Terry, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that the Concord letter also addresses the ferry flight analysis and the noise pollution, as well as other issues. Thank you.
Thank you. And Linda.
Neil, did you submit an article to the Concord Bridge? Or am I just imagining that?
Did I do what?
Submit an article to the Concord Bridge? Didn't I read?
I don't write articles for the papers. I've definitely let them know about this.
Okay.
I'm not sure they've done an expose on it.
Okay, so at least you've let them know about it, so it's on their list. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so thank you for those comments. And with that, I think I will move to approve this letter and send it to the Secretary Tepper and the and the MEPA office.
I'll second that.
Okay, so for a roll call vote,
Did you say Emily?
yes.
Oh, sorry, I heard a noise and it wasn't my name. Aye.
Linda,
I,
Jim,
Aye.
and I'm a yes. So unanimous. And I will send this around so that we can put our electronic signatures on it and get it out in the next day or so.
Mark, thank you for shepherding that process and drafting the letter.
Well, thank all of you for all the work you're doing behind the scenes as well. And with that, we're getting close to our 9 o'clock close. And the thing I would like to say is that our next scheduled meeting of HATS is May 23rd at 7 p.m. At that time, I'm just trying to find okay.
Mark, do we know if that's virtual or physical?
It's virtual.
Thank you.
So it'll be Thursday, May 23rd. The final agenda item I have here is there a interest in having another meeting in June? And if so, does anyone want to suggest a date that might work for them? I believe the third Thursday of June may not work for some of the members, but
Third Thursday is the 20th.
yes.
I'm gone from the 18th through the 30th on a family vacation, so this is a tough month for me.
Do we think we want to have another meeting in June, or should we be scheduling for further out?
I mean, I think barring any particular action regarding the North Airfield, there may not be a reason to meet in June if we are meeting in May. We should have the ESPR by then, ideally, which we probably won't have time to read, but we can certainly
Okay, so
discuss.
we will do an audible on future meetings at the May
Yeah.
3rd meeting.
Mark, do we need to do a ESPR comment letter possibly from HATS? And if so, I forget what Amber said the comment period is going to be. I think she said 60 days.
I said 60 days. She said extended. So I don't know what extended means.
I'm just wondering if we need another meeting sometime.
Sorry, Amber, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It will be at least 60 days.
Okay.
Okay.
So that would put us into July, I think.
Okay.
For the comment period. So maybe we can squeeze in something before the end of the comment period.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I said we would end at 9. It's 8:57. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, roll call vote. Emily.
Aye.
Jim.
Aye.
Linda.
I.
And I'm a yes. Linda, thank you so much for your service to the town of Concord and to HATS. And we're sorry you won't be here at the May 23rd meeting. We'll look forward to whoever else is appointed from the town of Concord Select Board.
I'm sure it'll be someone who has equal interest in all the items that are currently facing everyone right now. So thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Linda.
Thank you, Linda.
Good night, all.
All right.
Good night.